From crying and screaming in the courtroom to being unfazed by the verdict, no matter how they reacted, these unalivers were set to face a lifetime in lockup regardless. Their crimes shocked the nation, which is probably why the legal system worked to keep them as far away from the public for as long as possible. Number 12. Chris Watts. A case that shook the nation to its core. In 2018, Chris Watts appeared on television, pleading for his wife and daughter's safe return. Just a day or so earlier, Chris had called 911, claiming that Shannon Watts and daughters Bella and Celeste had been missing. In front of the camera, he appeared to be a distressed family man who just had his world destroyed, but investigators soon discovered that this was all an act. In reality, Chris knew exactly where his family was, disposed of at an oil site where he worked. He had unalived his entire family because they were standing in the way of his affair and the new life he wanted to start with his affair partner. Friends and family claimed that despite some tension in recent times, the couple had no problems whatsoever. They chalked up their recent disputes to stress over the new baby because at the time of the unaliving, Shannon was pregnant with the couple's third daughter. Allegedly, in August 2018, Shannon had confronted her husband over the affair. Words were exchanged, and the confrontation became physical. That was when, in a fit of rage, Chris strangled his pregnant wife. He then went inside his daughter's rooms and unalived them too. After investigators connected him to the crime, he tried to claim that Shannon was the one who had unalived their daughters. He claimed he had panicked and disposed of their bodies to hide his wife's crime. The affair and financial difficulties soon came to light, and Chris had no choice but to confess. In court, Shannon's father read out a heartfelt testimony, addressing Chris, stating that he was meant to protect them, and instead, he did the worst thing imaginable. Chris remained emotionless throughout the hearing, only crying when prosecutors showed the gruesome images of his children's remains. The judge was just as horrified by Chris's crimes as anyone else. In the end, Chris Watts was sentenced to 5 life sentences and will never be able to see the light of day again. Number 11. Nikolas Cruz. Nikolas Cruz carried out one of the most violent school shootings in United States history on February 14, 2018. At Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida, better known as the Parkland shooting. Armed with a semi-automatic, the 19-year-old former student entered the school and opened fire on students and staff, unaliving 17 people, 14 students and 3 teachers, and injuring many others. He had previously been expelled from the school for behavioral issues and had a history of disturbing online posts and violent threats. Investigators later revealed that Nikolas had planned the attack for months. He researched mass shootings, purchased all weapons legally, and chose Valentine's Day for the attack. Prosecutors argued that his motivations stemmed from a mixture of anger, isolation, and the need to be remembered. Nikolas had experienced a troubled childhood, including the passing of his adoptive parents, and struggled with mental health issues. Nikolas sat with his head down as families of the victims delivered emotional impact statements. The prosecution maintained that he fully understood his actions and deliberately carried out the attack. The case drew global media attention and sparked debates about gun control and school safety. In October 2018, Nikolas pleaded guilty to all 17 counts of unaliving and numerous counts of attempted unaliving. His legal team tried to use his mental health and background in an effort to avoid the capital penalty. After a lengthy trial in 2022, the judge sentenced Nikolas to life in prison without the possibility of parole. When the life sentences were formally announced, he did not react at all and was quietly led away to begin his life in prison. Number 10. Alex Murdaugh. Everyone in South Carolina knows the Murdaugh family, a group of powerful attorneys known in the state for being both rich and problematic. Alex Murdaugh's son, Paul, for example, was set to face trial over the accidental unaliving of a passenger on his speedboat while he was intoxicated. But before Paul could stand trial, his father unalived him along with Maggie Murdaugh. But why? In 2021, Alex called the police in a panic, alleging that he had arrived at the family's lodge and found his wife and son unalived by the dog kennels. Body cam footage shows Alex distraught and in emotional distress. He claimed he was with his mother at the time, who suffered from dementia. However, investigators were soon able to pinpoint Alex's location at the kennels at the time of the unaliving. They arrested him immediately, and the trial, dubbed as the trial of the century by the media, began not too long after. Alex maintained his innocence, shifting the blame between his son and his wife. He claimed they had unalived one another, and he was just the unlucky husband/father who found them there. However, the prosecution shut down the narrative pretty soon when they revealed a text message exchange between Maggie and a friend where she claimed that her husband had been acting fishy when he asked her to come by the lodge. Later, prosecution also revealed that Alex was stealing from his legal clients and was heavily addicted to substances, on the verge of bankruptcy, and distressed over Paul's trial. They claimed that Alex took the easy way out and unalived his family. While he maintained his innocence throughout the trial, crying during the prosecution's remarks and victim testimonies, the judge saw right through it. Alex was sentenced to serve out 2 life terms for both unalivings. Now, since the verdict in 2022, Alex has tried several times to file a dismissal, claiming that the legal clerk mishandled crucial evidence, but the appeals court has dismissed his motions. To this day, Alex Murdaugh claims he was framed. Number 9. Jodi Arias. Travis Alexander's friends and family members tried to warn him about Jodi Arias. They claimed she was unstable and prone to violent outbursts. All in all, the two of them had an extremely volatile and toxic relationship, but it took Travis a long time to actually break up with Jodi, and when he did, she unalived him. This case takes us back to 2008, where, in Mesa, Arizona, Travis's roommates returned to find him bleeding out in the shower with multiple stab wounds. It seemed like whoever had unalived him hated him. Investigators immediately traced Jodi Arias as a suspect, but she claimed that she was in California at the time of the unaliving. Her colleagues later testified that she had arrived at work in a panic that day, but soon went back to normal, claiming she just had a rough start. The truth was that after spending the night at Travis's home, Jodi flew in a jealous rage when she learned that he wanted to end things with her and was also talking to another woman already. Once faced with evidence tying her to the scene of the crime, Jodi changed her entire story. In fact, throughout the lengthy trial, Jodi changed her defense several times. She claimed that Travis was a horrible boyfriend who had allegedly hurt her over the course of their relationship. She also claimed self-defense on the night of the attack, stating that Travis had lunged at her and she was only trying to protect herself. Prosecution had ample evidence tying Jodi to the crime, and they even referred to Jodi's sly smirks during the hearing as proof that she was no survivor, as she claimed. The prosecution also claimed that Jodi was proud of what she had done and thoroughly believed she could get away with it. The case was long because Jodi was constantly changing her defense, and her legal team was wearing out the court system for as long as they could. But in 2013, the jury reached a guilty verdict, and the judge sentenced Jodi Arias to life behind bars. Number 8. Lori Vallow Daybell. Lori Vallow was head over heels in love with Chad Daybell, the author of an apocalyptic series. But Chad's work was not a work of fiction. He thoroughly believed that the world was ending, and that he was a prophet who could guide his followers through the end. Lori fed into his beliefs, and Chad announced that the two were meant to be, claiming that they had been married in several previous lifetimes. But the problem was that they were both married to other people when they met in 2015. Lori was married to Charles Vallow, and together they cared for 2 children, Tyee, Lori's daughter from a previous marriage, and JJ, Charles's grandson with special needs that the couple had adopted. Chad was also married to Tammy, and the couple shared 5 children. While Tammy shared in Chad's delusions, Charles was against Lori's beliefs. Chad's following grew day by day, and soon the LDS Church publicly distanced itself from him and his cult-like following. Alex Cox, Lori's brother, was also a part of this cult. Police first started looking into the couple's activities when JJ and Tyee were first reported missing. What they did not know was that the children had already been unalived, likely by Alex. They started looking into Charles's unaliving as well, which at the time, Alex had claimed was carried out in self-defense. They also looked into Tammy's passing, exhuming her body, and revealing that she had been strangled. When investigators went over to the couple's home in Idaho, they found out that they had already been married, just 2 weeks after Tammy was buried. A day after investigators had visited their residence, Lori and Chad packed up and moved to Hawaii. Alex Cox passed away from natural causes before police could interview him. This meant that the only 2 people who knew the truth were Lori and Chad, the last 2 people who would ever cooperate with the police. It took investigators many months to build a case against them, and it was not until 2019 that Lori and Chad were arrested. That was when, using GPS data retrieved from Alex's phone, they were able to find where Tyee and JJ were buried. The trial gained significant media attention, mostly because of the couple's bizarre beliefs and the lengths they went to. Lori decided to act as her own attorney in court, and her antics ironically helped the prosecution prove that she was an unstable woman who was capable of unaliving her whole family. Chad's trial went along separately, and he all but confessed to carrying out the doomsday plan. Lori claimed that she had unalived her whole family, and even attempted to unalive her niece's husband, Brandon Bordeaux, because they had turned into zombies. Brandon testified, having survived the attempt made on his life, that Lori was actually after his insurance money. Prosecution also showed that the couple had used Tammy's life insurance money to move to Hawaii and start a new life. The judge and jury had heard enough, and in 2023, Lori was sentenced to serve out a life term without the possibility of parole. Number 7. Darrell Brooks. 39-year-old Darrell Brooks had an extensive criminal record that went all the way back to 1999, when he was only 17 years old. In fact, at the time of the 2021 Christmas parade attack, Darrell was once again on the run from the police following a distress call made by his partner. She claimed they had gotten into a domestic dispute and he had attacked her. Darrell made a run for it in his red SUV before police arrived. He tried to claim that because of the immense stress that he was under, along with his diagnosis of BPD, he was not in control of his actions at the Christmas parade. However, the prosecution played videos taken from the event that showed Darrell deliberately running his vehicle into the crowd. The Waukesha Christmas parade had been cancelled in 2020 because of the pandemic, which made the 2021 celebration massive. In the video, a police officer can be seen banging on Darrell's windshield, trying to get him to stop from ramming into the crowd. To show that the attack was deliberate, the prosecution also noted Darrell's zigzag driving pattern. The case was open and shut. Darrell wanted to unalive as many people as he possibly could before being caught. A total of 5 people passed away from injuries sustained at the event. 4 women from the Dancing Grannies troupe and 1 8-year-old boy. Darrell represented himself in court, and it was a spectacle from start to finish. He claimed that he could not be prosecuted under the sovereign citizen movement, and was as disruptive as humanly possible during the prosecution's remarks, the victims' testimonies, and impact statements. The case had to be deferred several times because of his antics. Despite his attempts at prolonging the case, the jury was through with it. In 2022, they reached a guilty verdict and sentenced him to life behind bars. Number 6. James Holmes. James Holmes carried out one of the most infamous attacks in United States history on July 20th, 2012, in Aurora, Colorado. During a midnight premiere of a Batman film, James walked into a packed theater wearing tactical gear and began firing into the crowd. 12 people lost their lives and dozens more were injured. He was arrested shortly after, outside the theater, without putting up a fight. Investigators later discovered that James had spent months planning the attack. He legally bought firearms, ammunition, and protective gear, and even rigged his apartment with explosives. Prosecutors said the act was carefully thought out and meant to cause maximum fear and chaos. Before the attack, James had been a neuroscience graduate student but dropped out. His defense team later argued that he struggled with severe mental health problems and was not fully aware of reality when the attack happened. The trial lasted several years and drew massive media attention. Prosecutors presented detailed evidence showing how James planned everything. His defense focused on his mental state, claiming he was legally insane at the time. James showed almost no emotion. He sat quietly as survivors and victims' families spoke about how their lives were changed forever. However, in 2015, the jury rejected that argument and found him guilty on multiple counts related to the attack. When the judge officially announced the life sentences, James did not flinch. He knew this was coming. Number 5. Scott Peterson. To this day, Scott Peterson will tell anyone who listens that he is innocent. Back in 2002, his 8-month pregnant wife, Lacey Peterson, went missing, and suspicion immediately fell on him. Why? Because it eventually came to light that he was a serial cheater and had even told his most recent girlfriend that he was a widower. This was 2 weeks before Lacey was reported missing. However, according to Scott, he returned that day to find Lacey's car in the driveway, her keys, wallet, and cell phone intact, but Lacey herself missing. He told investigators that he had gone to play golf that day, and the last he remembered was Lacey watching Martha Stewart in the living room. After his televised appeal, his girlfriend, Amber Frey, came forward and told investigators everything she knew. This was when Lacey's family held a press conference, claiming that they now believed Scott had unalived their daughter. But it was not until many months later that their worst fears came true. The fetus and Lassie's torso were found along the shoreline. With only circumstantial evidence, the case against Scott Peterson went forward, and the prosecution claimed that there was more evidence than not to suggest that he had unalived his wife and unborn son. Scott tried maintaining his innocence, crying in court as they showed images of Lassie's decomposed body and their unborn son's lifeless body. He claimed he was innocent, but the jury went ahead with sentencing him to capital punishment. It was not until a few years later that a judge overturned the earlier conviction and ruled that Scott, while deplorable for his crimes, deserved a life in prison instead. Number 4. Susan Smith. Susan Smith shocked the nation in October 1994 after reporting that her car had been stolen with her 2 young sons inside. For more than a week, Susan appeared on television pleading for their safe return, asking the public to help bring them home. The story gained nationwide sympathy, but investigators soon began to notice inconsistencies in her account. After days of questioning, Susan confessed that she had driven her car to a lake in South Carolina and allowed it to roll into the water with her children strapped inside their car seats. Both boys lost their lives. Susan had publicly portrayed herself as a grieving mother. Prosecutors later argued that her motive centered on a romantic relationship with someone who had ended the affair. The man reportedly did not want children, and investigators believed she saw her sons as obstacles to that relationship and to the life she wanted. The trial in 1995 drew intense media coverage. Prosecutors presented Susan's confession and evidence showing she had planned the act and then fabricated the carjacking story. Her defense team focused on her mental health and emotional state, arguing that she was deeply depressed and not thinking clearly at the time. They tried to convince the jury to spare her from execution. After deliberation, the jury found her guilty of the unalivings. Susan was sentenced to life in prison, with the possibility of parole after 30 years. Susan broke down in tears. She cried openly in court as the reality of spending decades behind bars set in. She was scheduled for parole in 2024, which was denied. Now, Susan Smith has no way of ever being released. Number 3. Leticia Stauch. Leticia Stauch became widely known after the disappearance of her 11-year-old stepson, Gannon Stauch, in 2020. Leticia reported him missing, telling authorities he had left home and never returned. Evidence soon pointed to something far more disturbing. Investigators discovered that Gannon had been unalived inside the home and that Leticia had spent days trying to hide what happened. Authorities tracked her movements across several states, uncovering surveillance footage and forensic evidence that contradicted her claims. Eventually, she was arrested and charged in connection with Gannon's passing after his remains were later found in another state. Leticia pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity, claiming she was not mentally responsible. After deliberation, the jury rejected her insanity claim and found her guilty on all major charges. Number 2. Chandler Halderson. In July 2021, Chandler Halderson called 911, alleging that his parents, Bart and Krista, were missing. He claimed he had seen them just a day ago, traveling with an unknown couple, and that he had not heard from them since. Investigators could not find any trace of the couple and worried that something horrible had happened to them. Their worst fears came true when a torso, later identified as Bart's, was found in the woods with bullet holes in it. Just a day later, the police also found the remains of Krista. Chandler was an immediate suspect, and investigators believed that he had unalived his parents after they caught on to his many, many lies. Chandler had claimed that he was a student at a local technical school, had a job offer from SpaceX, and that he was making enough money to move away with his girlfriend. They later found out that Bart had called the technical school just a day before his disappearance and learned that Chandler had never enrolled there. Prosecution argued that Chandler panicked and decided to unalive his parents. His defense team claimed he was innocent and argued that all the evidence the prosecution was basing their case on was purely circumstantial. Sure, but the jury believed it was more than enough to convict Chandler for the unalivings, sentencing him to serve a lifetime in lockup. Number 1. Grant Amato. In 2019, Grant Amato, a registered nurse, shot and unalived his whole family, his parents and younger brother, at the family home in Florida. Why? Grant was obsessed with a Bulgarian camgirl named Sylvie and had spent over $200,000 to facilitate his obsession. His family had tried seeking help for him, even sent him to rehab, but nothing worked. It is believed that after returning from rehab, and having all of his devices taken away from him, effectively keeping her away from Sylvie, Grant decided to unalive his family and pin the crime on his brother. His goal was to cash in on their life insurance policies and then use that money to start a life with Sylvie in Bulgaria. The case drew widespread attention for several reasons, mostly because Grant came from an incredibly loving and supportive household and had once shared a close relationship with his brother, Cody. Grant had lied to his parents about starting a career as a streamer, making them buy him expensive equipment to facilitate this career, when he really used that money to talk to Sylvie. He had told her that he was a very successful gamer in the United States and sent her all sorts of gifts to win her affection. When his family found out, they gave him an ultimatum: either turn your life back around or leave the home. Prosecution alleged that after being caught talking to Sylvie once again, Bart told him to move out the next day. That next day, Grant shot his mother while she was using the family computer, shot his father when he came home, and then called Cody before shooting him in the doorway. The police were able to track Grant to a hotel less than 24 hours after the unalivings, and he claimed he was innocent despite the evidence against him. The prosecution did not have to work hard. In fact, Grant was sentenced to life in prison just a month after his trial began. When asked if he felt remorse, Grant responded with, "My family has been blaming me for months for ruining their lives, stealing, and not following the rules of the home, so I might as well be blamed for this too." Interestingly, Grant started a relationship with Victoria Goodwin, the ex-wife of Ghost Adventures host Aaron Goodwin, and even facilitated hiring a hitman to unalive Aaron so they could be together. The plan was stopped in its tracks, and Victoria was arrested. The only thing these criminals were sorry about was getting caught. From unalivers who laughed at their victims' families in court to criminals who openly claimed they would do it all over again, here's a list of unalivers who showed no remorse in court. Ted Bundy. Charming, polite, and incredibly intelligent. When Ted Bundy was arrested in 1975, no one could believe it. The headlines read that one of the most prolific unalivers and criminals in United States history had just been apprehended. The man responsible for unaliving and harming several women, 30 known victims, and many more, Bundy himself confessed to. But it was impossible for friends and family members to believe that the man they knew, loved, and respected could be behind such a horrific criminal spree. Bundy used his intelligence to his advantage. He kept up the ruse that he was a sociable and well-meaning Good Samaritan who would never even think of hurting a fly, much less a human being. But behind that facade was a dangerous criminal who would lure women at night across different states, pretending to need assistance or claiming he was an authority figure. Once he lured his victims, Bundy would then harm them before eventually unaliving. Worst yet, Bundy was incredibly proud of his crimes and is believed to have visited the burial sites of his victims later on to relish. His spree ended in 1975 after investigators put all the pieces together. They believed they were looking at 7 different criminals across 7 states, but it was one man all along. Interestingly enough, Bundy was not treated the same way as other prolific criminals. He had a swarm of supporters standing behind him, even as the prosecution painted the heinous picture of his crimes. This gave Bundy a sense of confidence that bordered on arrogance. The media captured several key moments from his trial, where he could be seen laughing during victim impact statements, or when friends and family members of his victims cried in court. Bundy showed no remorse. As soon as recess was called, he would start waving at his supporters. At one point, he shocked everyone with his callousness when he casually proposed to his girlfriend, Carol Ann Boone, during the trial. She even accepted his proposal right then and there. Bundy also insisted on acting as his own counsel in some cases and would ask the witnesses and victims questions himself. His arrogance was terrifying, especially for victims' families who believed that he would charm his way into an acquittal. The case became less about his crimes and more about his charisma, undermining what he had done during his spree. Eventually, in 1979, and probably to Bundy's own shock, he was convicted of unaliving 2 Florida State University girls. He was then charged with several other crimes and sentenced to capital punishment. Bundy and his attorneys tried to motion for a retrial. Petitions were filed on Bundy's behalf by his hordes of supporters, but the judge was not a fan of the serial unaliver. Eventually, in 1989, Bundy was electrocuted. Several hundred people arrived at the site during his execution, celebrating the end of one of the worst criminals America had ever seen. Anders Behring Breivik. Anders Behring committed one of the most heinous crimes in modern European history. unaliving 77 people in 2011 during 2 coordinated attacks. According to media reports, Andres had grown disillusioned with Europe's liberal policies. The far-right extremist believed that the liberal agenda was harming Europe, particularly his country, Norway. He was strongly against the government, as detailed in his manifesto, and urged other far-right extremists of taking actions to end policies such as immigration. His approach, however, was dramatic and dangerous. In July 2011, he detonated a car bomb in Oslo's government district, unaliving 8 people. But this was only phase 1 of his plan. While emergency responders rushed to the scene and media outlets focused on the car bombing, Anders quickly put on a disguise and made his way to the island of Utøya, where the youth wing of Norway's Labour Party was holding a summer camp. He approached the gates dressed as a policeman, claiming that because of the car bombing in the district's government sector, he was tasked with ensuring that everything was in order on the island. Once he gained access, he began firing indiscriminately at everyone there. Altogether, Anders unalived 69 people on the island, most of them young adults. He continued hunting for victims for approximately 1 hour, going as far as shooting at the lake to ensure that even those who had jumped inside the water to escape his terror did not make it out alive. Anders had carefully planned out everything, and it took emergency responders an hour to reach him because of the car bomb that he had earlier detonated. When he was finally apprehended, Anders accepted his fate without hesitation. Why? Because he did not believe that he had done anything wrong. That is right. During his emotionally charged and high-profile trial, Anders repeatedly claimed that he was acting in Norway's best interest, and if the judge truly cared about the country, he would be let go with a slap on the wrist at most. When his victims read their impact statements, and witnesses talked about the long-term effects the horror had on them, Anders openly mocked them and laughed in court. He even posed for the media with a raised, clenched fist, imitating a far-right signal. The case was just as horrific as it was shocking because of Anders's lack of responsibility for his crimes. However, he wept in court while he was handed a 21-year preventive detention sentence. In Norway, the maximum possible punishment is 21 years in a high-security prison, but that does not mean that Anders will definitely be eligible for release. The court system can increase his sentence for as long as they believe is necessary, and will likely push this to become a life sentence. Shockingly, Anders did receive some support for his ideologies, but the justice system did not give in to the fanfare. Dylann Roof. Did you know that Dylann Roof almost did not go through with his plan of shooting indiscriminately at members of the Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston, South Carolina? That's right. On June 17, 2015, Dylann claimed that he almost had a change of heart when he approached the members of the church and realized that they were actually kind-hearted people. However, the 21-year-old was so thoroughly brainwashed by his far-right ideas by then that he knew there was no going back. He was welcomed into the church that day, sat with the group of churchgoers during Bible study, and freely interacted with them. It was only after the session was complete that Dylann got up, pulled out his weapon, and began shooting at the crowd. According to witnesses, he even shouted racist slogans against the crowd as he fired, claiming that his goal was to start a race war. Altogether, 9 people were unalived within the church, including Reverend Clementa Pinckney, who was also a state senator. Dylann calmly walked out of the church after his brief and horrific massacre, ensuing a statewide manhunt. He was arrested less than 24 hours later at a traffic stop in North Carolina. His trial began in 2016, with the prosecution bringing his manifesto into evidence. They claimed that he had planned the attack and was on his way to committing several more crimes. While his defense tried to plead insanity, Dylann himself rejected that stance. He told the court that he was sane at the time of the attack and admitted that the prosecution was right. He would have, and wanted to, commit more crimes against people of color. This made the case an open and shut one. The judge believed that Dylann was incapable of feeling any empathy and would likely never show remorse for his actions. In 2017, after careful deliberation, the jury returned with a guilty verdict. The case became historic, as Dylann was the first person to receive capital punishment for a hate crime in the United States. Wesley Allen Dodd. Over 50 young boys, all below the age of 12 and some even as young as 2 years old, were harmed in some way or another by Wesley Allen Dodd. Investigators were aware of his actions and knew that he was not a first-time offender. They were also aware of his history, that Wesley had first started harming young boys when he himself was a preteen. However, every time he was caught, He would serve brief stints in jail before being recommended for counseling and released from prison. Wesley would complete his short probation, but never attend counseling. In his own words, he was constantly on the hunt for targets, as he referred to the young boys. Eventually, he moved to the David Douglas Park area, where he believed he could hunt most of his victims. Wesley's criminal spree began when he was only 13 years old, but it took a horrific turn in 1989. Before then, Wesley would just harm the boys, but let them go. In 1989, however, he was armed with a knife and shoelaces and planned on committing his first unaliving. His first two victims were 10 and 11-year-old brothers, Cole and William Neer. He lured them into the secluded area of the park, where he then tied them up, harmed them, and began stabbing them repeatedly. By the time the boys were found hours later, Cole had already passed away, and William passed away while en route to the hospital. His next crime came a few months later. Wesley traveled to Portland, where he managed to convince 4-year-old Lee to come back with him to his apartment. There, he harmed the boy all throughout the night, before waking up the next day and strangling him. Wesley was twisted in his actions. He even detailed every instance of harm in his diary and kept souvenirs of the crime. Wesley became more and more confident and increasingly deranged. Eventually, he tried to kidnap a 6-year-old child openly at a theater, but released the boy when he started kicking and screaming. The boy's mother's boyfriend then arrived at the scene, put Wesley in a headlock, and handed him over to the police. At his apartment, investigators found evidence, including his diary, that tied him to the unalivings of Cole, William, and Lee. Now, his court-appointed defense attorneys tried to claim that this was not the act of a sane individual and that Wesley deserved leniency because of his deranged mental health. The prosecution and, ironically, Wesley himself disagreed. Wesley addressed the court himself, asking for capital punishment. He claimed that if he were left alive, he would 100% commit more heinous crimes, this time worse than before, and also attack prison guards if given a lengthy prison sentence. Wesley urged the court to put everyone out of their misery and not drag the matter out. He recommended capital punishment for himself, and the judge agreed. In 1993, Wesley was executed in Washington state, marking the first legal hanging in the United States since the 1960s. Kendall Francois. From 1996 through 1998, Kendall Francois unalived 8 women in the Poughkeepsie area in New York. Kendall was an unassuming man who was only notable for his obesity and strong body odor. It was hard for him to find people to connect with, much less women who showed any interest in him. He began picking up women from the red light area in Poughkeepsie and was notably violent with them during their interactions. The women, most of whom were underprivileged and cautious of the police, did not file reports against Kendall for some time. This gave him the confidence to start unaliving women in 1996. All of his victims looked similar, white women of short stature and slim build. After unaliving the women, he would then stuff their bodies in the attic of his home that he shared with his parents and sister. While the police were suspicious of him since the time of his first few unalivings, they did not have anything concrete to charge him with. It was only after one of his victims managed to escape after a violent beating that police were able to charge him. They also received a search warrant for his home, where they saw a horrific sight. Not only was the entire home filled to the brim with filth, but there were also victims who were never even reported missing in the first place. The prosecution argued that Kendall particularly targeted workers he knew were either abandoned by their families or had no one to look after them. This was what gave him the confidence to be as violent as he wanted with the women. While his defense entered a not guilty plea, Kendall was anything but remorseful for what he had done. He laughed in court and admitted that it seemed easier to unalive the women than to start a relationship with someone. He was ultimately sentenced to a life term in 2000 without the possibility of parole. He passed away at the age of 43 while serving out his sentence. His passing was due to a disease he had contracted from one of the women he had been violent toward, an act of poetic justice. Philip Manshaus. In 2019, shortly after the Christchurch shooting in New Zealand, a 21-year-old Norwegian, Philip Manshaus, broke into the Al-Noor Mosque in Oslo and began firing into an empty mosque. 3 worshippers arrived at the scene and were able to apprehend Philip, later turning him in. While it seemed like Philip was just a deranged young adult who had a psychotic break, the truth was far darker. Earlier in the day, before loading his vehicle with his father's weapons, Philip had already committed an unaliving, his stepsister, Johan Jangjia Illa Hansen, According to testimonies by friends and family members, Philip had become increasingly cold and cruel toward his adopted sister. Johan had been adopted by Philip's stepmother, a Chinese orphan, when she was only 9 months old. Initially, Philip and Johan shared a close relationship. Many claimed that Johan looked up to her brother. Things changed in 2017. That was when Philip caused concern with his online activities. He became increasingly involved in far-right communities online, began openly talking about a race war, and was highly critical of immigration. This extended to his own sister, whom he started to resent for not being ethnically Norwegian. Philip even made remarks toward her, suggesting that if she were to ever have kids, it would result in race mixing, which he claimed was horrific. Johan tried to get through to her brother, and the entire family intervened to make things right, but Philip was rigid. Eventually, Johan started to distance herself from Philip, but repeatedly told her friends that she was fearful he might hurt her someday. The day came in 2019 when Philip waited for his parents to leave home, snuck into his father's cabinet, and retrieved guns. He then walked over to Johan's room and began firing at her. He shot her 3 times, twice in the chest and once in the head, unaliving her instantly. Afterward, he went to commit the terrorist act on the mosque that was ultimately foiled. In court, the defense argued that Philip's case was unfortunate, and the judge should show leniency because he was only 21 years old, clearly under the influence of online propaganda campaigns. Philip told the court, however, that he was in no way sorry for what he had done. If anything, he was proud of it, and believed that more far-right groups should come forward and do the same. The court ordered him to serve 21 years in preventive detention, the maximum sentence Norway can uphold. However, when he was due for parole, they recommended another 21-year sentence. Ultimately, the goal is to keep him locked up for the rest of his life. Ronnie O'Neal. Clips from Ronnie O'Neal's trial have gone viral all across the internet. In 2018, he unalived his ex-girlfriend and their daughter, while also shooting his son. He later burned their Riverview home, claiming that an assailant had entered the home and later burned it. Ronnie was unaware of the fact that his 8-year-old son had miraculously survived. When firefighters retrieved him from the burning home, his son immediately told them that Ronnie was the one who had unalived his mother and sister. 29-year-old Ronnie was arrested at the scene, but he put up a fight. Even when he was escorted to the station in the police van, Ronnie made absurd comments. He claimed that his ex-girlfriend and the mother of his kids was the devil, and that his kids were the devil's kids. Ronnie's behavior extended in court, where he rejected his right to have counsel, believing it was best to defend himself. The reason why clips from his courtroom appearances have gone viral is because of how insane they are. Ronnie would repeatedly go off on a tangent, unrelated to the charges that were brought up against him. He would also interrupt the prosecution and make obscene gestures at the judge. He even took the floor to cross-examine his own son when he went up to testify against his father. Ronnie tried to discredit his son, suggesting that he had a known history of lying. His own 8-year-old son, Judge Michelle Sisko, called it one of the worst cases she had ever tried in her 19-year career as a judge. Ronnie's antics might have delayed the judicial process, but the judge was firm in handing down her sentence. In 2021, Ronnie was sentenced to 3 life terms, 2 for the unaliving of his ex-girlfriend and daughter, and 1 for the attempted unaliving of his son. Juan Rodriguez Chavez. From March till July of 1995, Juan Chavez unalived 11 people in Dallas, Texas. His victims were chosen at random, and together with a teenage accomplice, Juan attacked anyone on the streets of Dallas. Ironically, during the attacks, he was released on parole from a separate unaliving conviction. Juan was one of 19 siblings born to farm workers who moved to Texas from Indiana. While the family did not have much, they were well liked in their community, and Juan was described as an overall pleasant child. However, in 1985, at only 17 years old, Juan and 2 accomplices broke into an elderly couple's home with the intention to rob them. Sometime during the robbery, they began firing at the couple, critically injuring one of them and unaliving the other. This raised Juan's conviction to an unaliving one, and he was sentenced to prison. There, he became increasingly more violent and even joined a prison gang. Despite his violent tendencies and multiple prison violations, Juan was paroled in 1994. He went to live with his sister in Dallas, and according to his parole officer, he really did seem like a changed man. However, old habits don't go away that easily. By 1995, Juan had befriended a mentally challenged 15-year-old, and together they began seeking out victims on the street to unalive. Because of the randomness of their attacks, the two of them were labeled as the thrill unalivers by the media. It took investigators a long time to tie the crimes back to Juan or his accomplice. The randomness of the attacks made investigators believe that they were all committed by different people. Eventually, using eyewitness testimonies, they managed to track down 5 possible suspects. The 5th one was Juan's teenage accomplice. In exchange for immunity and witness protection, the accomplice admitted to the crimes. He claimed that while Juan would usually commit the unalivings, suggesting that he wanted to rob the victims, he would very rarely take anything. Even when he did, he would ultimately discard those items. The prosecution claimed that Juan held no remorse for the terror that he had inflicted in the Dallas community, and that he was likely a repeat offender. He already was on parole for unaliving anyway. The judge heard the case and noted how Juan tried to antagonize the victims by repeatedly smirking at them during their testimonies. This made the case easy. Juan was sentenced to capital punishment. He was asked if he wanted to say anything in court. Juan took the stand and laughed at the jury, saying that he did not believe he had done anything wrong. In 2003, 34-year-old Juan Rodriguez Chavez was executed. Every day, millions of people get behind the wheel expecting to make it home safely. But for some, a moment of anger on the road turns into a decision that changes lives forever. We're taking a look at road rage criminals reacting to life sentences. Mackenzie Shirilla. Friends and family members had been begging Dominic Russo to break up with his girlfriend, 17-year-old Mackenzie Shirilla, for quite some time. The recent graduate from Strongsville High School had gotten together with the 20-year-old business owner in 2018. The relationship had its ups and downs, but things came to a head in 2021 when Mackenzie started openly talking about unaliving Dominic's life with her car. Dominic's mother talked about an incident in July 2021 where someone had to come pick up her son because Mackenzie had threatened to unalive him. In July of 2022, Mackenzie, Dominic, and his friend, Davion, were found unconscious in Mackenzie's Toyota as it had crashed into a brick wall. Responding officers claimed that it seemed like the car had split into two. Dominic and Davion were pronounced unalived at the scene, and Mackenzie was airlifted to a hospital, requiring multiple surgeries. The road to recovery was not easy for Mackenzie, but she miraculously survived. According to friends, Mackenzie was inconsolable when she learned Dominic and Davion had passed away. The police chalked it down to an accident, but then Davion's sister started getting suspicious. For starters, Mackenzie was a popular social media influencer who immediately went back to posting about her healing journey online. This included her posing in her wheelchair at concerts, stating that she was just someone who couldn't be unalived. Mackenzie had also arranged a Halloween party where she dressed up dummies as the corpses of Dominic and Davion. Police were alerted, and they started investigating the matter. They reviewed CCTV footage and made a shocking discovery. One camera showed the trio normally riding in their car as they made their way back from a party. And then the camera at the next traffic signal saw the car speeding at over 100 miles an hour. An expert was called, who determined that the car brakes were fully functional at the time of the impact. Police also noted that when they found Mackenzie unconscious in the car, her foot was still on the gas. She was called back for an interrogation and claimed that she blacked out during the incident and could not remember anything, but the case was clear now. In November 2021, Mackenzie was charged with vehicular homicide and possession of illegal substances, which were found on her at the time of the crash. While her defense team argued that this was a mistake and that Mackenzie's crash impacted her just as much as anyone else, the prosecution disagreed. They claimed that she knew what she was doing and showed recorded evidence of Mackenzie visiting the same site just 3 days before the event. They also pointed out that Dominic's side was the side that was struck against the brick wall. Davion just became collateral damage in the crime. Mackenzie cried throughout the trial, claiming her innocence. The judge, however, called her hell on wheels and sentenced her to serve 15 years to life in prison. She will be eligible for parole in 2038. Jesus Ayala and Jazamir Keys. In 2023, 17-year-old Jesus Ayala and 16-year-old Jazamir Keys stole a vehicle and intentionally crashed into Andreas Probst, the former chief of police for Bell, California, as he rode a bicycle in the Centennial Hills neighborhood. Prosecutors claimed that the duo was on a destructive streak that evening, stealing 4 vehicles and attacking anyone and everyone they saw. They had even attacked another bicyclist that evening and a driver in a parked car, both of whom survived with some major injuries. However, Andreas was not as lucky and passed away at the scene. For a week, investigators believed that it was a classic case of a hit and run and could not trace it back to the teens. It was not until a high school student alerted police to a video Jazamir had uploaded online, showing the incident. He was even recorded saying, "It is not that serious," after crashing into Andreas. Police were then able to zero in on the teens and charge them with vehicular homicide and reckless endangerment, among a list of other things. Ayala was also found to be involved in a July 2023 stabbing incident, but his defense team denied culpability in either case, alleging brain damage. The prosecution, however, challenged this claim. They pointed out that he was the driver on the day of the incident, had a whole week to come forward but did not, and that when police came to arrest him, he said, "I will just get a slap on the wrist." Prosecution argued that both Ayala and Keyes made use of the fact that they were juveniles, and that Nevada's law would not allow them to be sentenced to capital punishment or a life term without parole. However, the judge recognized that this was the case and decided to sentence them to 20 years to life in prison. Even by the time they would be eligible for parole, they would have spent half of their lives locked up. Dion Kimbro. In 2022, 30-year-old Eli Hickerson called 911 to report that someone driving a white box truck had just displayed a firearm at him while driving along the interstate. Eli claimed that he was headed back home from work when a truck belonging to a construction company began swerving along the interstate, and then the driver yelling profanities at him. Later, the driver showed him a weapon. After the 911 call was made, and police were reportedly on their way, they received an emergency call from the hospital. Eli had driven himself there, bleeding out, after having been shot multiple times. Police were sure who the culprit was. Days later, they arrested 22-year-old Dion Kimbro, who had worked a job for the construction company earlier that day and was also headed home. Prosecution claimed that Dion flew into a rage when he saw Eli signaling at him for speeding, and then picked up the phone to call the police. He then fired shots at Eli, from which he later passed away. This was a serious case, and the prosecution argued that Dion should be given the maximum sentence. The defense did not have much of a case, but they asked for leniency. The judge denied. Instead, Dion was sentenced to serve 60 years to life. Effectively, he will be over 80 years old when he even gets a shot at parole. Theodore Edgecomb. Evangelina Clearaman claimed that she was driving her car with her husband, Jason Clearaman, in the passenger seat when an altercation broke out between them and a cyclist, Theodore Edgecomb. She claimed that words were exchanged, and things got heated to the point that Theodore punched Jason, an immigration attorney. The Clearamans then followed Theodore as he rode away, allegedly to gather enough information about him to contact the police later on. However, Theodore's defense attorney painted a very different picture. He claimed that the Clearamans used racial slurs against his client and that they almost ran him off the road. What followed, according to Theodore, was an act of self-defense. However, Evangelina claims something else. In any case, Theodore shot at Jason, instantly unaliving him. In court, he was apologetic for the events and claimed that he wished he could change what happened that day. Both sides had their supporters in court during Theodore's sentencing, one arguing for leniency and the other pushing for capital punishment. Theodore's defense team pointed to the video footage of the incident that showed Jason approaching him. They alleged that he was intoxicated at the time of the incident. However, the judge noted that Theodore's self-defense claim was not valid because he shot Jason right in the temple, in an act of pure rage. He also pointed out that Theodore's previous convictions prohibited him from carrying a firearm. With all the facts in front of him, the judge sentenced Theodore to 25 years of initial confinement and 12 years of extended release. Theodore's family continues to fight the charges. Cameron Bernard. At just 19 years old, Cameron Bernard sealed his fate when he fired into another vehicle, shooting 3 passengers and unaliving one of them, Ryan Hampton. This was back in 2020, and investigators had to search far and wide to trace Cameron, someone with a lengthy criminal history. According to the prosecution, Cameron was in the passenger side of the vehicle when a road rage incident took place against 19-year-old Ryan Hampton. Ryan was in the car with 2 children at the time. Cameron's vehicle started pushing into Ryan's vehicle right before the alleged shooter started shooting at the vehicle. The 2 cars then collided, and Cameron and his accomplice made a run for it. Police arrived at the scene to find Ryan unalived and the two children seriously injured. They arrested Cameron later on, and he claimed that he was acting in self-defense after Ryan started driving recklessly. That was what his defense team alleged in court, but what the judge promptly dismissed. According to the judge, Cameron was already on probation and knew that he should not have had a firearm in the first place. He also fled the scene and then lied to the police when they first came to arrest him. With all the evidence laid out, the judge sentenced Cameron to 25 years to life in prison. Daha Hassan. Despite Daha Hassan claiming he shot at Ronnie O'Neal in self-defense, the jury believed otherwise. In 2024, Daha was reportedly driving on the wrong side of the Minneapolis interstate after midnight, also allegedly smoking in the vehicle. Randy had the right of way when the two cars came face to face with one another. He was also with his brother and other passengers in the vehicle during the incident. Daha refused to back away, which led to a heated confrontation between the two. Randy allegedly exited his vehicle and approached Daha. This is where he claims that Randy struck him, and he shot back at him in self-defense. The kicker, and the prosecution's whole argument, in this case, was that Randy had a neck brace and was visibly still recovering from other injuries even during the road rage incident. The jury also argued that Daha had several options that night. Simply backing his car up was one of them, yet he chose to unalive someone. The defense, however, argued that Daha acted responsibly and even called 911 himself. Bodycam footage was shown in court, which showed Randy bleeding out while they waited for police. At his sentencing hearing, Daha apologized. "I never wanted to kill anyone, ever in my life. I never wanted to hurt anyone, ever in my life. This is really hard for me. And I also want to say, if it wasn't clear before, that I am sorry to the families." In the end, he was sentenced to serving 14 years behind bars. Ethan Sterhouse and Dennis Perez. Shatera Coleman had received her master's degree just 2 months before her life was tragically taken away. In 2024, two men, Ethan Sterhouse and Dennis Perez, were driving recklessly in Michigan, brake-checking one another, and driving over 80 miles an hour, when they rammed into Shatera's car, veering her into oncoming traffic and leading to a head-on collision that ultimately took her life. Ethan and Dennis were immediately arrested and pleaded no contest to the unaliving. Both men claimed that they had no way of knowing that their actions that day would lead to a fatality. But the prosecution disagreed, stating that road safety laws existed for a reason, and there was no way that the defendants did not know that what they were doing would ultimately end in a tragedy. Ironically, the road rage incident was between the two men themselves and had nothing to do with Shatera, who became collateral damage. Ethan ultimately accepted a plea deal and a 15-year conviction. Dennis' case was unique because of his behavior with the prosecution, his own defense, and jailhouse guards while he awaited sentencing. Philip Todd, Shatera's husband, was also in court during sentencing and made a victim impact statement. He stated that he was set to celebrate his 1-year anniversary with Shatera in just a few days. While delivering his emotional address, he suddenly flew into a rage after noticing Dennis yawning and acting uninterested in what he had to say. The prosecution argued that Dennis was not apologetic at all for what he had done and urged a harsher sentence. The judge agreed and sentenced him to 20 years behind bars. Christian Hillman. By the time Christian Hillman completes his sentence, he will be 119 years old. That is right. In 2017, a Grand Rapids judge found the 19-year-old guilty of a road rage fatality and sentenced him to over 100 years in lockup, effectively a life sentence. Allegedly, Christian was riding his dirt bike when 64-year-old William McFarlane came up behind him in his vehicle, flashing his lights at him. McFarlane was trying to get Christian to move out of the lane, but words were exchanged, and the two pulled up into the church parking lot. That was where eyewitnesses argued that things took a devastating turn, and Christian started assaulting McFarlane. They claimed that after pushing him to the ground, Christian continued to kick the retiree several times before eventually fleeing the scene. McFarlane was then rushed to the hospital with several broken ribs and a broken skull. Emergency doctors stated that he had very little chance of survival. Ultimately, after spending 5 weeks in a coma, McFarlane passed away from his injuries. Christian's defense team argued that it was a case of self-defense, or at least involuntary manslaughter. The jury disagreed with the plea, stating that Christian could have stopped at any moment, especially when McFarlane had already fallen to the ground. His defense team argued that McFarlane followed him into the parking lot looking for a fight and just happened to get the worst of it. Gabriel Paul Horcasitas. Gabriel's case was a first. He had fired shots at Christopher Pelkey after a road rage incident turned lethal, instantly unaliving him. That, though, was not the unique aspect of this case. The prosecution used an AI-generated visual of the late Christopher in court to address Gabriel, detailing the severity of the crime that had been committed and how it would now affect his young family. The crime occurred in 2021 when, in Chandler, Arizona, both men stopped at a red light and Christopher exited his vehicle to confront Gabriel. He believed that the 54-year-old was driving recklessly and almost endangered him. However, according to eyewitnesses, just as Christopher approached Gabriel's vehicle, shots were heard. Gabriel's defense team argued that he acted in self-defense, pointing out that he was sitting in his car when Christopher made the first move to get out and come at him directly. Still, the prosecution argued that the victim was not armed and Gabriel did not have any probable reason to shoot at him. Christopher was rushed to a hospital, where he passed away on arrival. During the trial in 2025, the prosecution tugged at everyone's heartstrings when they introduced a key witness, Christopher himself. It was an AI rendering of the deceased, created by his sister, Stacey Wales. She claimed that the rendering was a way to show everyone in the courtroom the impact of Gabriel's actions and also bring closure to Christopher's family. In the end, Gabriel was sentenced to serve a decade behind bars. Bradley Wayne Wilkinson. In 2025, Bradley Wayne Wilkinson stood in a New South Wales courtroom as a judge handed down a 16-year prison sentence for a road rage encounter that turned fatal in Blackett. What began as a heated exchange on the road escalated in seconds and ended with a man losing his life. The incident unfolded in 2024 when Wilkinson became involved in an argument with another driver, Rice Harding. Witnesses described aggressive driving between the two vehicles before both men stopped. Prosecutors said Wilkinson deliberately used his car as a weapon, accelerating forward and pinning Harding between vehicles. The impact caused catastrophic injuries. Harding was rushed to the hospital but later passed away. Wilkinson did not deny that he was behind the wheel, but his defense argued that the situation spiraled out of control in the heat of the moment. They claimed there was fear, confusion, and a confrontation that escalated too quickly. The prosecution, however, told the court this was not an accident. They said Wilkinson made a choice, a split-second decision fueled by anger, and that choice cost a man his life. Harding's family delivered emotional victim impact statements, describing the permanent hole left in their lives. Wilkinson addressed the court, expressing remorse and saying he never intended for anyone to pass away that day. But Wilkinson was sentenced to 16 years behind bars, with a non-parole period that ensures he will spend well over a decade in prison before even being considered for release. Kenneth Miles Davis, Jr. Rush hour traffic in Washington, D.C. came to a terrifying standstill in May 2021 when a road rage encounter spiraled completely out of control. Behind the wheel of a luxury sports car, 45-year-old Kenneth Miles Davis, Jr. made a decision that would ultimately cost him decades of freedom. According to prosecutors, Kenneth was driving through heavy evening traffic when he became enraged after a woman allegedly cut him off on the road. Instead of letting it go, he stopped his vehicle, stepped out with a handgun, and walked directly toward her car. Inside the vehicle were her two young children, just 11 and 5 years old. Without warning, Kenneth opened fire into the car, striking the woman and sending glass flying toward the children. As terrified drivers tried to process what was happening, Kenneth then turned and fired additional rounds toward nearby bystanders before calmly returning to his vehicle and fleeing the scene. Investigators later tracked him down and arrested him. During the trial, prosecutors argued that this was an extreme act of road rage that could have easily turned into a mass casualty event. A jury ultimately found Kenneth guilty on multiple serious charges, including assault with intent to unalive while armed and several firearm offenses tied to the shooting. He was sentenced to more than 32 years in prison. Justin Nichols. In October 2021, a routine drive through Tucson, Arizona, turned fatal when a road rage confrontation escalated into gunfire. 32-year-old Justin Clark Nichols was riding a motorcycle when prosecutors say he became involved in a heated exchange with a nearby vehicle. According to investigators, Nichols pulled alongside a car carrying 21-year-old Savannah Nakaroti and another passenger. In a burst of rage, he fired multiple shots into the vehicle while still on the road. Savannah was struck and fatally wounded, while another passenger was injured but survived. Shockingly, there was also a young child inside the car at the time of the shooting, though the child was not physically harmed. Nichols fled the scene, but police tracked him down the very next day at a hotel, where they recovered the motorcycle and a handgun that matched the shell casings found at the scene. Nichols ultimately chose to plead guilty to second-degree unaliving, along with several additional firearm-related offenses. During his sentencing hearing, the courtroom was packed with Savannah's loved ones. More than 30 friends and family members attended, delivering emotional victim impact statements describing the devastating loss. Nichols addressed them directly, apologizing and claiming he did not realize who was inside the vehicle when he opened fire. The judge acknowledged the tragedy and the senseless nature of the violence. Nichols was sentenced to 20 years in prison. Even with credit for time served, he will be nearly 50 years old by the time he is released. Dakare Kinard. In the spring of 2023, what should have been an ordinary Saturday drive on Interstate 76 near Norton, Ohio, turned into a tragedy that would reshape two families forever. 40-year-old George Jensen was heading home from work when he became involved in a road rage confrontation with Dakare Kinard, then 30 years old. According to prosecutors, Kinard opened fire at Jensen's vehicle during the traffic dispute, striking him multiple times. Jensen was rushed to a nearby hospital with grave injuries but later passed away from the wounds he sustained in the shooting. Police described the encounter as an unprovoked act of rage on a busy stretch of roadway. After the incident, Kinard fled the area but was identified as a suspect. A jury later found Kinard guilty on multiple charges related to the shooting. In April 2024, a judge sentenced Kinard to 15 to 17.5 years in prison, a term meant to hold him accountable for the fatal shooting and protect the community from further violence.